Yeah, so obviously we're the guinea pigs here. That was a smooth change. I just wanted to say, Mike, how much it was an honor to be asked to do this, because like you, I think the work that you've done has always married history and social science, I would say more broadly. And I don't think there's anyone working in the social sciences who's had as big an impact on historians, particularly historians of modern Britain, than you. And certainly when I started reflecting on what would I say here, I realized that I can't unpick the intellectual dialogue that you and I must have been having when I was doing the Wolverhampton work and you were doing Preston. Actually, you were just ahead of me, so you'd done the Preston work. And I can't now recall whose ideas were whose, but I think a lot of them were yours, is the honest, because I'm thinking back to that work and how important the politics of place was as an idea to me. And I'm sure that I got that, not just from your book on Preston, but from then the work you were doing, talking about, see, what Mike really got was how important the way that Britain industrialized really was, and the way that many parts of the country were economies dominated by one industry, and the implications of that for thinking about the long-term rolling out of their history. And actually, although you're right that we've all sort of moved on, there is a sense in which probably we shouldn't have done, because what we're living through within Britain at the moment is the consequences of that particular pattern of historical evolution and the way those economies were structured, often around one industry, very rarely more than a couple of industries. So that was the core, but it's carried on as a dialogue with history, because basically Mike always, it seems to me, thinks about historical process when he's thinking about the present and where we're going. And in turn, he's been so innovative methodologically that particularly in the work reanalyzing social science archives, that's generated a whole explosion of work. And today, everyone on the panel, unfortunately, Rob is somewhat detained because childcare fell through, and Ava's joined us, which is lovely, Ava. But he's not currently going to sit on the panel because I think that will just make things even more difficult.
Otherwise, Ava will want to speak.
Exactly, yeah. And oh, I've lost my copy. So because everyone's talking about Mike's most recent, well, the work that Mike was doing in the 2010s is still shaping a lot of history work today. So everyone is bouncing off that work because that's the nature of intellectual disciplines. But I just wanted to say a few brief words about Mike's first two books. The Preston book, The Dynamics of Working Class Politics, and then this book, so these are the two that I'm going to just talk briefly about now, and the work that came out from that, because it seems to me, oh yes, I wanted to share this with you. Ava, would you like to repeat it? When I was reading The Remaking of the British Working Class, I was working on my book called Speaking for the People, and I largely disagreed with almost everything that was in it, but in ways that were so creative, because I was trying, and because I also wanted to say material structures really matter, but I think I wanted to give much more credit to the autonomous role of political language than Mike was willing to do at that point. But it was so helpful thinking through what I did agree with and what I didn't, to really ground what I was hoping my work would say, which is that historians were getting obsessed by language because it freed them from the need to go to Preston or Wolverhampton, because it's hard work going to Preston and Wolverhampton if you don't already live there. In other words, the hard work of dealing with the complexities of life as it was lived in the everyday. And in a sense, we were liberating ourselves from that. So it was really so important to read something that said, no, you've got to take the material grounding of politics and the way that it happened seriously. So I was trying to sort of think, well, what are the things? Because as I say, I think that there are still things in those two books that historians anyway, but probably all of us, political scientists, social scientists, need to be thinking about. Because what Mike was trying to do was to to think about what it means that you have a long history. And if you look at the politics of radical right populism today, it is very rooted in the past, and it's very rooted in the particularism of Wolverhampton or Preston or wherever you want to name, and pretending to understand it, because many of them don't understand that, but they know that the political elite have no interest in the peculiarities of place, the politics of place. So dynamics, I thought, was great for giving me that sharpening my sense of place and making it not about Wolverhampton, but about everywhere and what was distinctive about it. But the remaking, what I disagreed about it was I thought it was a sort of reassertion of a homogeneous working class thesis, which I'd spent the 80s trying to unpick in my mind. But what I loved about it was the way that you moved from talking only really about employment structures in dynamics. So this was a book that was much more about demography and thinking about the stabilizing of urban communities in the late 19th century, to think about migration and how it worked out over time. So this sort of demographic understanding of class, and things like then how that was compounded after the First World War by rent control, which I thought was my idea, but when I reread this, I discovered it was Mike's, or maybe it was ours, I don't know, but anyway. People don't often think about this, but suddenly after the First World War, there was a massive disincentive to move house because only existing tenancies were protected at a low market rent. So people stopped moving. In the 19th century, most people moved every year. And these sorts of things were core to what Mike was trying to do with this book, to make us think about long-term social processes and their unforeseen but massive consequences. So yes, in some ways we've all moved on, but I think in important ways, it's always good to revisit those things and think, well, do they have something to tell us about at least some of the multiple crises that we're going through today? And I think they do. Anyway, now, how do you want to go, Rob? Because originally you were going to go last. Do you think that's safe, or would you rather go first? Because Ava seems quite happy at the moment. Shall I introduce everybody and then we can gamble? I'll introduce everyone and then, yeah, see how it goes. But I think we might change the order. So the order had been first Florence, Sutcliffe, Braithwaite. Actually, we signed no titles, didn't we? So Florence's work, I sensibly wrote down the titles of everyone's books just now because I can never remember them. But Florence's book was Class Politics and the Decline of Deference, 2018, and Women in the Miners' Strike, 2023. Florence is now working on a long history of homelessness in London, or more broad, in London, from the 19th century to the present. Then Peter Mandler, Cambridge, sorry, I said UCL, didn't I? Peter's books, I can't possibly rehearse them all, but the ones that probably are most recent, The Rise of Meritocracy. The Crisis of Meritocracy, that's right. That's why I wrote them down. Meritocracy.
Someone else grabbed The Rise of Meritocracy.
They did, didn't they? Yeah, The Crisis of Meritocracy, I'm so sorry. A history of Margaret Mead. He's now working, crucially, I think, on something that really bounces off of Mike's work, which is a long history of the impact of social science on vernacular, on the everyday, on the way we see the world. And that's what he's going to talk about today. And then Rob, also incredibly, 2 monographs in 5 years, 2018. I'm going to do even worse on the title here. No, it's Thinking Black, that's right. Brilliant book. And then Colonized by 2023. So the same 5-year span. I'm really sorry. And Rob, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that might be just.
I think it might be safest. Yeah. Do you want that seat or that seat? Or do you want to be here? Yeah. So Rob is at Queen Mary and is now working on borders and the history of border control. So over to you, Rob.
Okay, thanks very much. Apologies, I
she was supposed to be with her grandma today, but her grandma pulled a sickie, and I got kind of lumbered with her. But I'm only going to speak for 10 minutes, which is hopefully about how long she can stay subdued for. So I wanted to start by saying thank you to Mike for inviting me to this event and to John for organising this panel. I probably should have come to Mike's work as John did through those early books on Preston and on industrialisation, although in my defence I was probably about 9 years old when they came out. Instead, it was Identities and Social Change in 2010 that really introduced me to Mike's work. And it's a book that I've returned to a lot of times since its publication, as well as Mike's other work on the history of social research and its relationship to the making of social class in Britain. And I found it an extraordinarily productive body of work. Mike's method, as we know, is to return to past social science studies in order to understand the social and political role of sociology in modern Britain and how it shaped academic thinking about identity, class, and indeed also history and historical time, and how it became popular, or how it became integrated into popular life, both as an experience, the experience of being researched, and as a method. But something that's always interested me as a historian of race, which is really my area of specialism, is that these sociological studies from mid-century Britain and onwards that Mike focuses on to tell the history that he tells in Identities and Social Change were really very little interested in matters of race. And indeed, the growing body of work by historians responding to Mike's work and trying out similar ideas and similar methods has also largely centred on sociological studies that ask very little about race. Part of what Identities and Social Change tracks is the rise of the idea of identity as a sociological category with popular purchase. But I think from the vantage of our present, when to talk about the politics of identity or about identity politics is almost always to talk about matters of race and ethnicity, it's quite surprising to go back to these works and find these matters so little present. So what I'm going to offer today is a brief reading of where race fits into the account of the history of sociology in Britain that Mike offers us, and a few provocations about how forefronting race allows us to see that history differently and to ask new questions through Mike's work. And my first point in this paper is that the absence of race from the studies that Mike considers is no coincidence. And we need to therefore think historically about the politics of race within the emerging sociology as the modern rationalist project that Mike shows us in Identities and Social Change. And to do this, we can begin by thinking about the social and political role of sociology in the post-Second World War period. There's a growing historiography which largely follows Mike's work and charts the links between the rise and institutionalization of the sociological discipline, the projects of social democratic planning, and the making of social democratic citizenship. And the rise of sociology, as these historical works have shown, was linked integrally to the development of new forms of social democratic citizenship. The social sciences played a prominent role in policy formation in the era of social planning, and they received increased state funding for that reason. And a key objective of much post-war sociological research in Britain was to identify and maximize a culture of social democracy for the state's new social democratic citizens. I'm thinking, for example, of Lise Butler's work on Michael Young here, which people will probably be familiar with. The social science that Mike asks us to consider was concentrated, as he puts it, on discovering average or ordinary properties of the social, which was in itself an investment in discovering through new scientific means the qualities of the nation. But we should pause to consider the wider context here. Yes, this was, as Mike puts a lot of emphasis on, the moment of technocracy and rational planning. It was the era of social provision and efforts to building a social democratic culture. But 1962, the year that Mike identifies as the moment of sociology in his book, was also the high point of post-war decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean, and the year of the first Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which began the process of sealing off the rights of UK citizenship from British colonial and Commonwealth citizens. If sociology sought to discover the properties of the nation, we should remember then that this was at a time that nation and race were increasingly being thought together. And the consequences of this have been noted most starkly by Satnam Verdi, who's described the sociological study of the British working class, which formed the bedrock of the expanding academic field of sociology, as effectively the study of the white male worker. If we pause for a moment to consider how sociology assumed its key social and political role, we can get some indication of how the marginalization of both race and racial difference was worked in. So Michael Young, for example, when he reflected later in life in an interview with Peter Hennessy on his minimal engagement with the question of racism in his work, explained to Hennessy that not one of Beveridge's 5 giants were racial prejudice. I think it's an interesting remark. It captures that kind of closed circle of reasoning which can govern relations between political priorities, social planning, and social research. We might also flip it around and look at the other side of the scale, at the decisions behind some of the key studies. So Identities and Social Change opens with Goldthorpe and Lockwood's affluent worker study conducted in Luton in 1962, the moment of sociology. The study, as Mike's analysis emphasizes, aims to interrogate a social process, embourgeoisement, which was intended to be separate from questions of specific locality and local community. Luton was chosen precisely as what Mike calls a potential English middle town, somewhere that could be anywhere. And the analysis, as Mike emphasizes, sought to study social change, this is his words, wrested from community and in the same process detached from locale. But actually, when we dig into it, locale does matter for a study like this. In John Lawrence's book, Me, 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 he also returns to Goldthorpe and Lockwood's Luton study. And in an aside, when he introduces the study, John notes that Goldthorpe and Lockwood dropped their plans to study embourgeoisement in Bedford because the population was, in their terms, ethnically too diverse, and they settled instead on Luton. Now, Luton's lack of diversity was also not simply fortuitous. When a by-election ran in the town just after the study finished in 1963, polling revealed strong anti-immigrant sentiment among the electors. Luton itself had grown into a London satellite town in the mid-20th century, out-migrations from London, population movements that were almost totally white until at least 1970, and were also lived within those categories quite often. At the same time, many industrial firms in the early 60s operated colour bars. So although there were, in fact, almost 2,000 migrants from the Commonwealth living in Luton, only a small proportion would have secured the kind of highly paid industrial jobs selected for Goldthorpe and Lockwood's investigation of affluent workers. And this is that study of affluent workers is itself a study that is in part about sociological theory, about engaging with Marxist theories of embourgeoisement, but it was directed by the specific political concerns about the future of a culture for social democracy, or more basically, about the electoral future of the Labour Party. And again, it's interesting to think in those terms about who gets included within that culture. So it's for these reasons that I and some of my colleagues have argued for greater attention to the unmarked whiteness of the kinds of sociological enterprises studied in books like Mike's and by many of the historians he's influenced. And this is of a piece with, I think, the unmarked whiteness of British social democracy itself in terms of the institutions, social processes, and materialities of its reproduction, and both its social and its democratic imaginations. But at this point, we might also think about the fact that the rise of sociology was not only the rise of a system for studying, imagining, and perhaps providing the means for a politics of allocating resources and investment towards mostly white people. If, as Mike has argued, the 1950s and 60s was the era of academic sociology's rise, the number of academic researchers concerned with race relations certainly remained negligible in its early period. The British Sociological Association, a body whose formation Mike identifies as another index of that moment of sociology, had in its register of members in 1965 recorded only 2 out of its 137 members as concerned with race relations research. But all of this changes dramatically by the late 1960s. So the BSA chooses race relations as the theme of its annual conference for the first time in 1969. In January, the following year, the Social Science Research Council grants funding to establish a race relations research unit at the University of Bristol, providing the first institutional home for race relations research within the academy. In October, the Community Relations Commission, funded through the 1968 Race Relations Act, begins its own research journal, New Community. And for the academic year beginning that autumn, New Society records that there are at least 167 research projects in race relations currently underway. So the sociological projects that Mike and others have focused on largely dealt with white people, and frequently they did so to ask questions about class. And actually, as an aside, I wonder what the connections might be between this fact that you study white people to ask questions about class and the ways in which a discussion of what is described as the working class and their interests in British political culture has so often meant a discussion of white folk. This was a population approached at the time not as a problem, except perhaps for the electoral fortunes of the left, but instead as an index of modern society itself. By contrast, the social projects that cohered under the terms race relations and community relations social research concentrated predominantly upon people of colour, and these people were approached most often as a problem. The question often at the heart of the newly funded race relations agenda, as A.H. Halsey controversially observed in 1970, was how to avoid unrest. Its defining question, Halsey said, was, will they revolt? And this was a body of work that's hardly negligible in size. The Grenadian anti-racist educationalist Gus John would write in 1970 that he was overwhelmed with the academic social science and race relations. For those working in race relations social work, the volume of social research projects shaped the conditions of their labour. So in Birmingham's Handsworth in the late 1970s, for example, so many sociologists had come to examine the local population that one vicar put a sign outside his youth club saying Handsworth is not a zoo. Young black people in Manchester expressed their anger at the same time, as one report put it, of being the subjects of even more surveys, researches, studies, and reports. All this contrasts dramatically with the account of the social role and political purchase and purpose of academic sociology provided in Mike's book. And it leads me to ask what a history of the rise of sociology would look like, which asked the same questions as Mike's, but took as its starting point this later moment of sociology, post-1968, in the expanding terrains of the newly christened race relations industry. I don't have time to offer comments on that, and there's too much work to still do. But I want to thank Mike Savage for making it possible for us to ask these kinds of questions. And I believe if anyone were in a position to take up that work at the scale that Mike offers in Identities and Social Change, we might get a very revealing insight into the politics of race in modern Britain and how it's shaped by and through, as well as in resistance to, the power of social research. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm just going to take the biscuits back. I wonder, Rob,
Yeah.
whether... No, it's fine. I wonder in the circumstances, I was planning to just have the 3 papers and then any questions, but in the circumstances, if anyone wants a question.
Just come back in if
You sure? Well, I just wonder if there's anything that people might want to just ask for question of detail rather than anything else. Well, we definitely have you. Otherwise, we'll move on to hear from Florence, I think, next. Sure, okay. Yeah.
Is there a live stream in another room?
There is, yeah.
Which room is it in?
It's just the one bottom.
I might go there. I'll watch it
Okay.
there and come back. in.
Disrupt them.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. So kind of you.
Thanks. Apologies.
So, not at all. And well done, Ava. So we'll give Rob a slightly, a few moments to get to the other room. I think we did well there. So, yeah, of course. Are you standing up or staying? Right. Okay, so as I say, the plan is to hear the next 2 papers and then to have half an hour at the end that's free. Because we finished, the break is 11:30, I think, is that right? That's what I understand. So that should give us a good half an hour, because you're not going to talk for more than 15 minutes, are you? Okay, so Florence, thanks.
Thank you, John. And thank you everyone for coming. I hope that you'll forgive me for starting with a brief autobiographical reflection that I think illuminates just how formative Mike's work has been for my own research. When I was an undergraduate, I took a paper called British Society in the 20th Century. Although this was the early 2000s, the paper actually really finished in the mid-1980s at the very latest. John Goldthorpe, David Lockwood, Frank Beckhoff, Jennifer Platz, The Affluent Worker in the Class Structure was one of the set texts, and to me at least, pretty much the last word on post-war working class identities. I still have and still refer to frequently the over 30 pages of notes that I took on the book. So when I started work as a graduate student with John Lawrence, and he recommended that I read Mike's 2005 article, Working Class Identities in the 1960s, revisiting the affluent worker study, it was therefore really intellectually exciting to me to find a new way of looking at the text and the research materials on which it was based. Mike's 2010 book, Identities and Social Change, that Rob's already referred to, came out just as I was shaping my doctoral research and was really formative for one half of my intellectual agenda in that research. So one of the things I set out to do in that project was to kind of fill in the gap between the mid-1960s period up to which Mike focused intensively, particularly for the 1960s through, as we've already heard, his restudy of the affluent worker research materials. And then I wanted to fill in the period between then and the 1990s, a period which Mike has also focused on quite a lot through restudy of mass observation materials and through his own sociological research. I also found Mike's critique of Anthony Giddens and Ulrich Beck's theories of individualization in the late 1990s and early 2000s very convincing. And this was particularly pertinent to my research project, given that its other half was an examination of what politicians from Margaret Thatcher to Tony Blair had to say about class, and Blair was, of course, a big fan of Giddens. Mike suggested, however, that Giddens and Beck, quote, radically misconceived the relationship between individual and class identities, posing what he called an analytical opposition between traditional class cultures and new individualized ones, which actually wasn't borne out in empirical work and which failed to capture, I quote, the complex interweaving of class and culture. In the years since Mike's 2010 book came out, the restudy of archived sociological materials has really blossomed amongst historians of modern Britain. Much of this work, like mine, like that of John Lawrence, like that of Selina Todd and Rebecca Goldsmith, has focused again on class and on related attitudes towards community and individualism. And that work has generally been quite closely related to questions about political change. Other strands of work in this vein have kind of branched out, focusing on popular politics, more broadly conceived, as in Alex Hill's work, which sketches out the orientations towards the future held by a broad range of social groups in wartime and post-war Britain. And then yet others have moved away from questions of political history and have used archived sociological collections to reconstruct more kind of social histories. So, for example, Charlotte Greenhalgh's study of aging in 20th century Britain, and David Cowan's reuse of the affluent worker materials to examine how working class couples in the early 60s Luton thought about parenting. So this element of Mike's work then has, like other aspects that John's mentioned and that Peter is going to go on to talk about, made a really huge impact on the field of modern British history, on the sources that historians turn to and on the questions that they ask. He's really been one of the crucial figures launching the study of what has come to be described often as the vernacular or vernacular discourses in modern Britain. As his work has been incredibly influential, however, it has also been somewhat controversial. Perhaps most notably, a 2022 roundtable in the journal 20th Century British History brought together John Goldthorpe with Mike, John Lawrence, and several other historians to discuss the increasing focus on the social sciences and their footprint within modern British history, and the increasing prominence of the reanalysis of archived sociological research materials. Goldthorpe offered a critical perspective, suggesting that he saw most attempts to reanalyze the affluent worker materials as, at the very least, quite flawed. Goldthorpe had several kind of interlinked critiques. he suggested that these studies had mistaken assumptions about key parts of the study's design, and that it was improper for scholars to pay any attention to the free-form comments that interviewers often wrote on the back of interview questionnaires at the end of their interviewing sessions, given that these were placed to blow off steam and not an attempt to collect any sort of comparable or quantifiable data. Goldthorpe acknowledged, as I think one would expect him to, given that he himself trained as a historian at UCL, that the historian's craft differs in a fundamental way from that of the sociologist. Where sociologists design and carry out their own studies, historians almost always have to use the somewhat randomly preserved relics of the past to try to reconstruct something about that past. As Goldthorpe himself put it in an essay on the uses of history in sociology, these relics that exist are, quote, just a limited selection of all that could have survived, a sample, so to speak, of a total universe of relics, where, however, neither the properties of the universe nor of the sample are or can be known. So I think Goldthorpe's fundamental problem with the reuse of archived sociological materials, at least in the way that historians have tended to be doing it, was really a kind of methodological one. He suggested that sociologists in the social survey tradition, his tradition, take the view that the degree of individual heterogeneity that exists in any form of human society is such that descriptions need to be based on representative samples of populations of interest, and to take the basic form of statements of relative frequencies. He therefore seemed frustrated with restudies of archived social survey responses that made statements about what, for example, some or many of the respondents alluded to without quantifying what those terms meant. He wanted researchers, I think, really, to, if they were going to reuse this material, recode it, recount it, and set out their methodology for coding and counting very explicitly so that others could assess it. He perhaps seemed to imply that generalizable statements about whole populations can really only be based on well put together random samples of those populations, which might in fact render the affluent worker materials very difficult to reuse, because rather than being a random sample, it was designed as a kind of critical case study of the most potentially affluent workers in Britain at the time. What I think about the kind of debate between Goldthorpe and his historian interlocutors that kind of was a little bit missed at the time, though, is that I think there is something that goes beyond a methodological difference between sociologists working in the sample survey tradition and historians. So there's something that goes beyond our relative proclivities for coding and counting, or our respective feelings about the need to know the relationship of the sample that we have to the whole universe from which it was taken. I think there's another underlying difference, which is perhaps even more fundamental, that is in how the two groups conceive of and want to study individual subjectivities. To kind of understand this, I think it's worth going back to the affluent worker study again. So the affluent worker study very much fitted into what I think was probably the most dominant way of thinking about the connections between class structures and class consciousness or political action for British sociologists in the late 50s and 60s. This was the kind of model that was outlined by Elizabeth Bott in 1957, when she said, the ingredients, the raw materials of class ideology are located in the individual's primary social experiences rather than in his position in a socioeconomic category. Sociological studies therefore had to look at organization and type of work, home, and community that an individual kind of experiences on a day-to-day basis in order to understand how those mold a particular view of the class structure and one's own position in it, and then how this generates a particular type of consciousness and a particular type of political action. This was the kind of model that underpinned David Lockwood's famous 1966 article on the three types of socio-political culture found in the working class, and which fed very directly into the affluent worker study. Now, by the later 1960s and 1970s, sociologists were continuing to use this approach, but they were feeling increasingly frustrated with it. You see this frustration coming out in a whole range of publications of occupational cultures at this time. And I think you also see it, interestingly, in an article published by one of the affluent worker researchers herself, Jennifer Platt, in 1971, where she suggested that respondents' views of class in the study had actually been far more complicated than the three categories of class, status, and money imagery that into which they had been grouped in the course of that project. She said respondents were unsure of the nature of social stratification. They, quote, frequently did not make or did not grasp the distinction between determinants and correlates of class, and their views of class were often contradictory. General ideas, she said, are often held without appreciation of their full particular implications. In a piece that he co-wrote with Fiona Devine in 2005, Mike summed up what had happened to this structure consciousness action model between the late 1950s and the kind of mid-1970s. The model became a straitjacket that stifled research on ambivalence, and stuck in this impasse, sociologists of class abandoned the study of culture for class structure that came to dominate the subdiscipline in the 1980s and early 1990s. So Goldthorpe, for example, turned in the 70s to the massive Nuffield study of social mobility. So, the fresh enthusiasm with which historians turned in the past kind of decade or two to archived sociological research materials, which had come to seem so frustrating or intractable to sociologists by the early 1970s, stems, I think, from the fact that historians have tended to approach these sources with rather different assumptions about the relationship between structures and subjectivities. To understand that, I think we need to think about what's happened to the discipline of history across the same sort of time period. Since the 1980s, I think I'll pull out just two things that have kind of reshaped how historians have worked. The first is the influence of Gramscian ideas, which have provided one major impetus to take seriously ideology and hegemony, and which provided one kind of impetus towards the development of what was called the new political history from the 1980s onwards. The other is the set of ideas associated with the linguistic turn or postmodernism, which, as John has already mentioned, was kind of producing a major challenge to social and political history, as both of those had been done before the 1980s. Those ideas, of course, deconstructed the idea of a unitary self and prompted historians, even those who didn't go the full Foucauldian hog, to focus on discourses and how they make up subjects. Cultural history, which was basically what resulted from the impact of post-structuralism on social history, however, had its own problems. One was articulated by Peter in an article in the first issue of Cultural and Social History in 2004. How can cultural historians assess the throw or power or reach of the discourses that they trace in places like mass media? Another was raised by Mike Roper in a piece the following year, where he argued that emotion and subjectivity seem to have, quote, slipped out of view. So what I would suggest is that it was into this space that Mike's intervention stepped. He illuminated that there was this potentially vast and entirely untapped repository of supposedly ordinary people talking about their own lives. And this material historians leapt on as a way of trying to map the throw of cultural discourses and to excavate and attempt to reconstruct historical subjectivities. But rather than assuming those subjectivities were or should be stable and coherent, they could be approached with postmodern ideas about the instability of the self as part of the historian's arsenal. Thus, James Hinton, in the first of two books that he published based on testimonies from the Mass Observation Project in 2010, outlined what he saw these testimonies as shedding light on, not as shedding light on fixed selves with identities and attitudes that could be measured scientifically, but rather on the creative moment in which an individual, struggling to make sense of him or herself in the world, will bend, select, recombine, amend, or transform sources of meaning available in the public culture. Mike's work had prompted me to reject simple oppositions between class and individualization and to think about the complex interweaving of class and culture. His methodological interventions then, I think, helped a whole tranche of historians to come up with a way of answering some of the problems that had arisen in cultural, social, and political history. That, I think, lies at the kind of heart of what's made him so influential.
Thank you very much. You've got slides.
I do. Can I just capture them?
I don't know. You might need help. I'd wait. Because I wrecked everything just now. So while that's happening, thank you very much, Florence. Over to Peter, who's going to engage directly, I think, with.
That's the first one. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter.
So, I mean, I started out as an historian the way Mike did, but I never made the conversion. Well, I think of myself as a sociologist manqué, and I've always read a lot of sociology. But one of the I won't say disappointing features of academic life, it's just a reality, is that we do all live in our disciplinary cultures. That's not siloing per se, but it is, you know, develop communities, we get to develop friends, we feel comfortable, we start using a shorthand, and it's hard to break through. And it's really remarkable to find someone who is as amphibious as Mike is. I mean, last night I had a little bit of a fanboy experience when I met David Grusky at dinner, and I've been reading and appreciating and using his work for years, and I've never set eyes on him. And it was always unlikely that I would, because we just inhabit different spaces. And actually, Sam Friedman, more or less the same. I think I've met Sam once. I was at a symposium that I invited him to, and otherwise we live in separate worlds, but I read his work and benefit from all the time. Mike is actually the only sociologist who I've seen regularly over decades, and that's because he is in lots of spaces, and hats off to him. There's only so much time in the day, in the year. Somehow Mike finds time for us all. So one disciplinary difference between historians and sociologists is that, as you discovered, we tend to read from our scripts. It's slightly peculiar, I suppose, because when we lecture to students, we're talking to slides the way sociologists do. But I don't know, I think it's something about the being very careful about the words. And in this case, I only worked out what I wanted to say when I was writing it, so I've got to stick to my script. I won't, of course, stick to my script. I will try to stick to my time. So when I started teaching seriously the history of class in the 20th century about 25 years ago, before that I was mostly teaching about the 19th century and about politics, I inherited a set of assumptions largely from Edward Thompson and Eric Hobsbawm about the traditional working class, which was pretty much made by the early 20th century. I mean, that's partly also because when I was educated, I mean, your course ended in the 1980s, but my modern history course ended in 1914. Our analysis, or at least my analysis, was therefore highly descriptive and largely based on social scientific or semi-pseudo social scientific accounts of a static entity from the likes of Richard Hoggart or Peter Wilmot and Michael Young or Raymond Williams. These accounts also formed the basis for a lot of the secondary literature, notably Ross McKibben's Classes and Cultures of 1998, which was then more or less my Bible. Even then, though, I wanted to extend the dynamics of class, what was continuously making the working class, into the later 20th century. And for this purpose, the best resource into the 20th century. And for this purpose, the best resource I had was Savage and Miles' remaking of the British Working Class, 1840 to 1940, published in 1994, about which we've already heard from John. Though I think honorable mention also goes to Joanna Burke's Working Class Cultures in Britain, 1890 to 1960, published in the same year, which brought gender into the equation in a very then original and novel way. These books restored the dynamics to class formation in the 20th century. Savage and Miles' special contributions lay in pointing to the reshaping of the urban fabric as suburbanization made inner cities more homogeneous, more working class, in fact. Rent control, which I'd completely forgotten about, but that, of course, it factors into the same stabilization. Occupational change made the workforce more industrial, and especially as the growth and scale of culture and society broke down barriers within and homogenized the working class, notably illustrated with these striking charts. Still, I think, one of the most ingenious statistical demonstrations of class structure we have, taking advantage of the fact, which I think was first exploited by Andy, was it? Another amphibian. Taking advantage of the fact that marriage certificates contained information not only about husbands' occupations, but also about their fathers' occupations, and importantly, their fathers-in-law as well. That was still true when I was married in the 1980s, and I remember my wife had to strike out the line saying father's occupation, and you actually had to write into a box that didn't exist what her own occupation was. With this very ingenious use of marriage certificates, Mike and Andy were able to divine some very fine but significant changes in social mobility, not between manual and non-manual occupations, which was then minimal, but within the manual, between unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled strata, the boundaries between which were blurring. Now, in the last 25 years, less and less attention has been paid, and you've heard about this from both John and Florence, by historians at least, to these dynamics, these sociological dynamics, and more to how or whether they have been discursively represented in class consciousness, class typologies, and disproportionately in politics. And I do think it is still a striking feature that a lot of the people who are writing about class, historians, both in this new discursive mode as well as in the old sociological mode, really had a political agenda in mind, and other aspects of class culture, class life were marginal to them. My own teaching undoubtedly has reflected this shift, but I still do think of the question of class as a dynamic relationship between social change and representation, much as, of course, Edward Thompson did 60 years ago. And here we've been influenced again by Mike's work as he moved in Identities and Social Change. The title itself expresses that dynamic relationship to looking to more recent decades. As he says himself in his introduction, he began that project asking what these social science sources revealed about the changing nature of popular identities in recent decades, very much in the mold I've been describing of using social science sources as documentary sources about class. But then he says, he realized that the form within which these sources took was itself the product of social science. The generation of social categories, he writes, involved wresting people from the landscape and arraying them in general and categorical terms, associated with the endeavor of the post-war social science apparatus to construct a modern, rational nation, which was amenable to intervention and management, and which itself depended on defining a homogeneous nation with clear geographical boundaries made up of specific social groups. Can I say, Mike, I particularly appreciate your awareness that the word is homogeneous and not homogeneous, which is actually a term from chemistry. I know, language shouldn't be prescriptive and all that, but still makes my teeth grind when I hear homogeneous. Either you or your proofreader or your copy editor got that right every single time. Now, we can hear in this realization the clear reverberation of Foucauldian ideas of governmentality, but also, more congenial to historians, I think, an older awareness of the semi-autonomy of social representation, especially political representation, from social change, something that's been around a long time, but has been newly applied to mass politics in what is now called the new political history, which Florence referenced, of which actually John Lawrence over there is often seen as the Fons et Origo. Now, the most enduring impact of Mike's highlighting of the role of the post-war social science apparatus in composing much of the material we had casually relied upon to construct our own historical ideas of class in the 20th century has been, perhaps counterintuitively, this powerful movement, which Florence talked about, to read through that social science data to try to find vernacular understandings of social change, of identities, and of politics, but behind or beneath the social scientists' own framings. A vernacular language not so much derived from those framings or even from the interface with social science, but from older, other, different sources. And this so-called secondary analysis of social survey data, which John Goldthorpe took such exception to, trying to find these vernacular languages under the surface, primarily applied to qualitative surveys based on interviews or long-form written questionnaires, especially the kinds of things that are hard to code and to process in the way that Goldthorpe liked to do. this secondary analysis has been one of the most fruitful and exciting developments of the last couple decades in modern British history, and actually not only in political history. Sorry, that was my hat tip to John and the origins of the new political history. And there we have some of the titles that actually I think you mentioned every single one of those, Florence. All of them based on secondary analysis. And again, John has been a pioneer, but there have been many others in his wake, Florence in the van, and still more in the offing. Now, why do I say this is a somewhat counterintuitive development from Mike's book? Because I think it is, actually. I have to say, when I read Mike's book, I thought that I was going to get the secondary analysis, and I didn't. After all, he sets out in his introduction his goal to uncover accounts of popular identity, which are formed in an intersection between various experts and different groups of people themselves. Consistent with that interactionist perspective between social experience and representation, he distances himself from a strong constructionist view in which social science experts are held to have the power to make up and construct the world in manners of their own choosing, because he is committed to recognizing and recapturing the recalcitrant and unruly voices of the sources. And yet, he actually decides not to go down the route of the secondary analysis of social survey data. The field notes of qualitative researchers, he regrets, are too messy to use to assess the validity of their own conclusions, and the purposive nature of qualitative research makes the idea of raw data futile. That has not put historians off. We like things messy. We like things recalcitrant and unruly, and in the ways that John and Florence have both described, I think we've made great hay with them. Now, despite the inspiration he gave to secondary analysis and the quest for the vernacular, what this book is really about is the sociologists themselves, and this is something that Rob drew attention to. The purpose of researchers, what their methods were, and what they betokened, and thus the subtitle, which I think is a genuine clue to the contents of the book, The Politics of Method. But this is not an inward-looking book about sociologists only. But it is still an interactionist account of class formation. But the class in question is not the working class, rather the middle class, a new technical middle class, a birth in the 1960s, claiming new craft and technical skills which allowed elements from the traditional middle classes to avoid increasingly staid and snobbish claims to cultural superiority, these are Mike's words, and enabled them to position themselves as technically valuable and with the kind of meritocratic skills that a modern nation required. For these purposes, a technocratic social science was supremely useful, represented for Savage by the birth of the magazine New Society in 1962, the Robbins-era expansion in higher education, and of course the proliferation of social surveys, which end up telling us as much about the worldview of the new middle class as it does about the consciousness of the scrutinized subjects. And Rob mentioned some other markers of that new technocratic age and the identities it generated, like the affluent worker study and the founding of the BSA. Now here Mike was contributing to a subject that had long interested him in other guises, the remaking of the British middle class, notably in his important early work on bank clerks and their incredible power to police the class and gender lines of their profession in the early 20th century. Of course, by the late 20th century, the middle class had swollen in size and significance and diversified, and thus the more complex middle class typology that Mike developed in social class in the 21st century. If historians weren't always one generation behind, we would have been talking a lot more about that book, but we haven't got really to the 21st century. But an important further lesson, important at least to me, is that ideas about class propagated by and suited to this new technical middle class language start to spread. Instead of something innate or prescribed, class now, this is Mike's words again, is relativized and externalized, a contested mode of classification, something to be navigated by strategically mobile individuals, and where embraced or avowed, it is portrayed as elective belonging, an important concept too in John's work, a more conscious sense of community, most easily held by those who have chosen it rather than been born into it, which seems to require an abstract conception of social groups, and thus in the end does owe a good deal to social science discourse. In my own work, I'm taking this idea a step further to show how much earlier and more widely, well beyond the technical middle class, one could find these abstract conceptions of social groups. And because I'm not only interested in class, abstracts of all kinds, invisible structures in the self, in society and economy, imagined communities based on the life course, generations, sexualities, and other identity criteria. As the social scientist James Flynn long argued, across the 20th century and probably in this first urban nation in the 19th century too, people have put on what Flynn called scientific spectacles to cope with the increasingly complex and variegated challenges modern life throws at them, and have demonstrated their ability to replace a more utilitarian approach to the world with classification, abstraction, and logic, which for Flynn accounts for steadily rising IQ scores across the developed world in the 20th century. These skills obviously vary with education and indeed class, but they are much more generally diffused than we often imagine. Thus, Anthony Giddens doubled her hermeneutic. In Giddens' words, the development of sociological knowledge is parasitical upon lay agents' concepts. On the other hand, notions coined in the meta-language of the social sciences routinely re-enter the universe of actions they were initially formulated to describe or account for. And this is not something that only happens in the last 40 years, as Giddens imagines, but it's been happening for, well, 200 years, and especially the last century. If I were speaking to historians, I would have said exactly the same thing, but I would have quoted Ian Hacking's work on the looping effect of humankind's. As far as I can tell, Giddens and Hacking say the same thing at the same time and never refer to each other. Another sign of disciplinary, I won't call them silos, communities. It's fine, you know, they're both right. Now, I give you here, this is, yeah, no, I know, I'm on my last page. A small sample, terms either coined or repurposed by social scientists, many originating in the 19th century, but only widely propagated in the 20th. People may not always use these terms in the everyday vernacular, but they recognize them and make use of them to understand the world in which they live. In Identities and Social Change, Mike allowed for this briefly, where he identified in some social surveys, such as Elizabeth Bott's, evidence of a population already interested in social science. It's prime evidence to him of the rise of elective belonging, and he also noted Giddens' double hermeneutic approvingly. But I would want to argue that even where belonging was still not so much a matter of conscious choice, popular understandings of social groups and other invisible or imagined structures was already well developed, had to be, in order to grasp and navigate the modern world. You can have a powerful sense of the economy and its personal implications for you, which people increasingly do from the 1920s onwards, with or without an ability to do much about it. And people's language of individualization was also much richer and much earlier than the overt language of Freudianism, which Mike sees creeping in after 1948. For me, showing how this unfolds, not only in everyday concepts, but also in data, visual representations, therapies, group enrollment, and politics, is a work in progress, but it is just the latest in a long series of inspirations that I've taken from the work of Mike Savage. Thanks.
Okay, so we should give a few moments for Rob to get back to us from the other room. So in that time, if you want to compose your questions in your minds, that would be helpful. The thing you left up there, Peter,
Yeah.
what was that from?
Oh, I just made that up. As
Oh, I see,
Yeah,
right. I was going to say, because that was like,
Yeah.
it's like a scattergun of
Yeah, yeah,
everything.
exactly.
Yeah, it was plausible, but it didn't exist.
And I
Historians will do that.
I could put up a dozen of those.
I just couldn't quite believe it was scattergun.
No, it's
Legion.
not real.
No. Right. Hi, Rob. Okay, so questions from the floor. We've got just under 25 minutes. Or general observations. Yes. Hold it down, apparently.
There you go. Oops.
I think
It was on. It's on.
it's only on when you're holding it. Yeah.
Yeah, Adrian Favel. So going back to the initial comments by John and Rob, and this is a point really about lack of comparisons that we're hearing. So you know, the UK-centric aspect of the story. If you went to Preston today, it'd be, you know, a very diverse story, as Rob is suggesting. You know, Britain has got diversity, but it's a diversity that includes post-empire groups, religious minorities, and new migrant groups. I just wonder how much of this alternative story based on a race relations perspective is a bit over-determined by the Afro-Caribbean focus of it. I mean, that's the question really. And it's a question really about, the black and white story as a determining factor in the shaping of British race relations, but also the fact that race itself in Britain is a very peculiar, sui generis kind of concept in other ways.
Rob, do you want to
Sure.
comment on that?
If I understood your point correctly, I mean, firstly, I think it's true to say one of the interesting things about the body of work that coheres under those terms, community relations and race relations, as a kind of research enterprise, but it's also part of what kind of pejoratively becomes termed by the early 70s the race relations industry. This kind of complex of social research, planning, policy, kind of funds allocation. Is really, it's called community or race, but it's really about people of color, and it's predominantly about Afro-Caribbean or African Caribbean initially, and later South Asian Britons, to the extent that the kind of multi-ethnicity of Britain doesn't kind of get a full recognition within that body of work. Actually, that point about Bedford being ethnically too diverse. Someone said to me after I actually quoted you on that at the launch of your book, and someone, they were talking about Italians.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, predominantly. Yeah.
I think the point still stands that I was making, but but that's not, again, there's dimensions of that diversity that don't get a look in through the questions that frame that kind of research. I think it's changed a huge amount since the 80s, really since The Empire Strikes Back, the book that most people will be familiar with, which critiqued what they termed white sociology, by which they meant kind of what's called race relations sociology. And now, if you look at the work that's going on, looking at, for example, conviviality, people like Siva Mohan Valavan, and others. There's a brilliant study called Bowling Together, again, against Bowling Alone, which is set in a Finsbury Park bowling lane. And those are much more alive to kind of just difference itself, right? Difference as a condition under which people live. But I think that is something that has happened actually from an academic perspective, kind of post 80s, yeah.
I mean, it's worth saying, with how the sociologists obscured ethnicity, that in the affluent worker study, there is no criterion. You cannot see. So people are South Asian, but you only discover that if they tell you, literally, if their testimony, because they were doing class. And so they didn't exclude, and there were very few, but they didn't exclude someone who was a person of color, but there were loads of Irish people, but again, only if they told you that they were Irish. Do you, the historian now rereading it, know that they were Irish?
Well,
and you're right about the Italian
side of that is that it is a double, that there's at once mechanisms through which whiteness is centered in terms of the research subjects, but not exclusively, as you say, but also that, the questions being asked. So race is kind of doubly marginalized, racial otherness and questions about race. And actually John's book picks up on this quite well at a number of points where people raise it independently and it gets quite shut down.
Yeah. We're not meant to be talking about that.
Exactly. That's yeah.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Thanks so much. So this is more a comment for discussion, but firstly, that was a really interesting set of reflections. But taking up Peter's point about the double hermeneutic, can we think about what that means for the future? And are we likely to see, I'm thinking about the rise of reform, I'm thinking about the anecdote that is told about Brexit debates and somebody from an audience being told, an audience being told that GNP or GDP would reduce if we left the EU, if the UK left the EU, and someone sort of heckling from the audience and saying, but that's your GDP. Yeah. So to me, that is a sense of a double hermeneutic at a meta level of saying we're actually going to reject the managerial, technocratic ways of understanding society, what's good for people, what's good for society. And I just wonder if you have any reflections from what you've been doing historically on how that might unwind in the future.
There's a very good interdisciplinary study that Emily Robinson at Sussex wrote about the politics of feeling in Brexit, in the Brexit debate, which she wrote with her politics colleague, whose name I've John Moss, thank you, which actually addresses that question. Now, she typically, as an historian, finds many layers. So, I mean, another way of summing up this is Michael Gove's "We don't need any experts," and her analysis of that. Actually, I'm not even sure. I wonder whether she mentions the any questions moment that you cite, because it's perfect for her purposes. She says, well, actually, people are, of course, just using their own versions of expertise. It's not actually they're against expertise. They just have taken possession of alternative sources of expertise. And this is what our Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This is the way he is shrouding his anti-science discourse. He says, no, I'm not anti-science. I want every citizen to use their God-given and democratic right to go to the internet and find their own expert. And so I think there is undoubtedly a further proliferation of technocratic discourses. It's just that they're no longer so consensualized. That makes it difficult for those of us who, I mean, actually, it's been one of the principal goals of many academics for the last 50 years is to deconcentralize everything and to fragment everything. And
where it got us.
Exactly. We now reap what we've sown. This is something that Florence has written about.
Yeah, Florence, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I agree with what Peter said. I mean, I think that one of the kind of dynamics that has increased in kind of pace over the post-war decades has been the sort of decline of deference to, which has kind of impacted in a lot of different fields, but one of the fields it's definitely impacted in is how people think about experts. But it is difficult to celebrate the idea of people thinking for themselves, but then also say, oh, but don't think that. I mean, it seems very plausible to me that the rise of the internet has kind of happened at a moment where it's kind of intersected in ultimately quite troubling ways with the decline of deference and the rise of a sort of insistence that everyone should think for themselves. Because, to come back to the example of science and vaccines and health, certainly in Britain, a lot of health policy does involve boiling down very complicated issues into very simplistic advice that everyone is given in a very blanket way. You have to breastfeed. There's no, there's no kind of wiggle room in a lot of the advice that you're given by health experts, and that's because they're looking at the whole population and thinking, well, we need to give a simple message because that's likely to have the best possible effects. But then people are also able to go on the internet and look up their own studies and kind of say, well, you're saying everyone has to do this, but actually I've read the scientific evidence and it doesn't look quite as clear cut as you're making out. And the whole of science is kind of based on contesting everything.
Right. Until you don't.
Everything at face value. But then you take it out, expect to take it out into the public and kind of say, no, that there are actually simple facts. It's in conflict with, I think, the kind of dynamic of popular culture over the last kind of 50, 60 years in quite a big way. It's not a very helpful answer.
I'm not sure I have any answers either. I mean, I think one thing that historians probably can help with, particularly this work that's being done on sort of vernacular understandings, is to map some continuities over the long durée of attitudes that aren't always that obvious from survey sort of data, depending on how the questions are asked. But I mean, like a thing I often talk about is the very, very deep-rooted way that welfare is thought of contractually. If you look at the discourse, it's very contractual. I paid in, I should get back. They don't pay in, they're not contributors. And that is national insurance as created in 1911 as a model. You pay a bit, the employer pays a bit, the state plays a bit, was what Lloyd George said. And it's become vernacular common sense in a way that's nothing that, you know, has happened since to layer on more universalist humanitarian understandings of welfare has dislodged. And there's a deep reason for that. And it would be better on the whole for politicians to think about how do you make entitlement look contractual than how do you change that instinctive way that people think about benefit and entitlement in Britain, I would argue. So I think there are things that historians can do to make sense. The other thing I would say is that we're in a time of transition, and almost certainly both the communicators trying to simplify science are learning how to do it in a world of a proliferation of knowledge, and people consuming knowledge are also, over time, you know, I won't be around, but they're going to work out how to deal with social media or they'll die. I mean, I'm joking, but there's an evolutionary principle here. Eventually, we will work through this crisis, like the crisis of print or television, where essentially people get smart about how to use new forms of information. And at the moment, they are struggling. Mike, you don't agree with that? You've got to hold it down, apparently. Yours is noisy. That's it.
Yeah, that was just trying. I wanted to move on a bit, just to kind of pose a big question. It comes out actually of all your talks about kind of what is sociology. What I was trying to do in that Identities and Social Change book is to register the fact that sociology is a historical subject. It comes at a particular moment in time. And in the British case, it was the 60s, remember, but as well pointed out, there has different iterations in the 70s and 80s. And I'm very mindful, you know, that in the contemporary neoliberal academy, sociology is on the defensive, and we're trying to defend sociology. But what is it we are defending? You know, when actually the subject is very recent. And you know, what was really, really clear from the field notes and all the work I was doing at that time was at that point, sociology was really much a social movement. You know? It was campaigners, it was people who were passionate about social justice who got into sociology, and the origins of British university degrees very much in that. Well, that was 50 years ago, and kind of where do we think about sociology in the 21st century, recognising that historical mutability? I'm aware that in this room we have at least two presidents of the British Sociological Association, ex-presidents, Susan Halford and Convened, and two presidents of the American Sociological Association, Michelle Lamont and Annette Leroux. So lots of expertise here, because I think it's the kind of paradox. We want to defend sociology as a critical way of thinking, but we need also to recognise it as it doesn't exist as a discipline with a capital D. It's always historically mutable. So that's more of a kind of comment, really. But I think it shows just how important it is to understand this historical mutability.
Got hand at the back.
So I'll ask that question the other way around, which is to say, what should the relationship between history and sociology be like in the future? What happened to historical sociology? And if, as Philip Abrams said, we're all doing the same thing anyway, why haven't the historians on the panel taken the plunge?
Well, interesting. I think I have occasionally, but Florence, do you want to comment on?
Why have we not kind of?
No, I mean, well, yes, you can talk about that, but I mean, I think a lot of historians, I mean, I think on the panel, most people here probably do try to think sociologically, or at least through a social science prism, in the same way that I was saying, what's attractive about Mike's work is he's always thinking historically about process. I think it is a defining feature of a lot of modern social history that people are engaged with thinking about, maybe not applying social theory, which was very popular 30, 40 years ago, but engaging with the debates. I mean, you're right that Peter pointed out that I just stole your elective belonging as, I mean, accredited, but as a way of thinking about some of the things that I was identifying in the testimony for me. I think that is going on constantly. But the other side of your question, I'm trying to think, I mean, because you're also saying is...
Well, I'm interested because I started as a historian and I'm currently called a sociologist. So I'm interested because I also struggle with the disciplinary boundary, but as Peter was saying, it's about where you fetch up in space and the time you have to engage with people who generally have communities of, intellectual.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's one.
I was just thinking about oral history, which is the one field in which historians actually do what sociologists generally do, go out and generate our own data, and which is a research method that I've used a lot in my own research. But I think it's interesting how different still a lot of the underlying assumptions are. Oral historians are generally not concerned about constructing a representative sample in any way, shape or form. And partly that's to do with funding, as well as sort of disciplinary assumptions. But also I think it does come back to kind of what we see ourselves as doing, and kind of how we understand the relationship between the people who we're speaking to, and the kind of the way that we're interested in understanding them as idiosyncratic individuals, but who en masse start to build up a series of windows into culture at large. And because we're so comfortable dealing with random bits of stuff from the past, we're comfortable dealing with random bits of stuff when it comes to our own oral history projects.
I mean, there are obviously big institutional pressures. I mean, funding you mentioned is one, professionalization, journals, and so on is another. I'm not going to tell the story because Mike told me I wasn't allowed to tell it, about a now disguised interdisciplinary project which wanted to publish in journals in 2 different disciplines, but was told firmly that it had to, by both journals on both sides, I think, that they either had to plump for sociology or plump for history, and they couldn't do both. They wouldn't publish a special issue, which makes these. But so there are all these disciplinary pressures. Now, I used to be a little bit more critical of those, and recently, for political reasons, I've become less, because there's so much bullshit being propagated by government in the name of interdisciplinarity. Mostly, it's about protein chemistry. That is, people in the Treasury have been told that protein chemistry wouldn't have happened if it weren't for a dialogue between chemistry and biology, and therefore, everyone has to do that. And everything else is siloing and disciplinarization and narrow and specialized. And I think that's just actually really going one way of discrediting our basic disciplinary professional structures, which I think most work originates in a discipline. But what all I try to do myself is read in other disciplines. Even though I don't go to your conferences, you only have so much time. Mike manages to do it all, but I can't do it all. I read all your work, and then I try to merge it with my own disciplinary perspective. But I wouldn't say to you all, start going to psychology conferences, start going to anthropology conferences, start going to history conferences, because you don't want to set up impossible tasks. Looks like Michelle.
Yes.
Hi there. So I am neither an Orian or an ologist, but I would like to raise a question for Mike, to think a little bit about the social history of the border that is lurking in your work, and I'm wondering if you can kind of go back to those Preston times to think about the border as a kind of fundamental rhetorical and material device for maintaining exclusion, always predicated on race. But the kind of recent instantiations that we're seeing around the convening power of a so-called ours, our identity, our resources, our future. And I wondered if you could speak back to the Preston times in order to speak to the present, and the kind of work that borders do in disciplining not only race, but actually in giving politicians a profound excuse not to have to deal with innate inequalities.
Yes, it's a big question. Never nearly had lost it, which actually I think we'll circulate to the day. It's a big having session on the urban, and actually some of my comments this evening about that issue. But it does go back to what's raised what I was trying to do at Identities and Social Change book, which was to think about how the nation state is constructed, which obviously involves also creating borders around that nation state and creating these mechanisms which distinguish the nation from the non-nation. And I got more interested actually, recently, very much the work I'm doing currently is thinking about the sense of the contingency of the nation. So much social science is predicated on the nation as being the natural unit of analysis. And you just take it for granted that different nations. You do comparative analysis by mashing up data sets from different nations, but actually, for the vast amount of human history, we haven't had nations, we've had empires and imperial forms of organisation. And it goes back to this point about the post-war. It's a point I do bring out a bit in the Identities of Social Change book, that the social scientists were really important. The social science apparatus, to use the phrase which was used in the panel, helps construct the nation with its borders. And that's absolutely complicit, if you like, or significant in that project. And as you say, the racialized aspect isn't something I bring out in the book, but Rob brought it out, but it's absolutely there. It then poses the issue if the social science apparatus is failing, which I think it is, or at least it's under massive stress. That's also having significance around borders, and I've become really interested in the recent work around Britain. Britain has never really been a nation state exactly. We've always been an empire, and for a while we tried to imagine Britain as a nation state, but never really succeeded. We have Wales and Scotland anyway, and Ireland was a bit complicated, and let alone the imperial colonies and all that, the post-imperial territory. And in a way, we're now returning to that kind of imperial formation. So I think the borders question is crucial to that way, and how borders are constructed. But I think will be a theme which crops up later.
I'm conscious that, Rob, that is the work you're now doing. Do you want to just say something? But you don't have to, given the circumstances.
I'm not going to.
Okay. So I think, Michan, did you want to? Yeah.
I feel like you're so lucky in some ways in the UK that you've had such a strong discipline of history. And the same is true of France, where your history has been hegemonic and global and imperial, and it has made the current state of, I think, although those French, discipline of French history and British history has declined a lot. But what we see in the American context, and I don't know what the other American sociologists in the room would think, but in terms of the labor market, historical sociology has absolutely plummeted. At the same time as I think our discipline has been more and more inclined toward reductionism, in part because psychology, field experiments, experimental methods have become extremely popular. And a lot of sociologists have been pressured to do narrower understanding of what explanation is about in terms of counterfactual, more and more narrow. So when Florence mentioned critical case study, I teach qualitative methods. No one talks about the methodology of critical case study in the American context. So I find myself listening to all this to say, yeah, the boundaries of our discipline are greatly, greatly challenged, but in some ways I look at British sociology and I'm a little bit nostalgic for the kind of training that I had as a graduate student, which seems to be more and more disappearing. So.
Thank you.
On the joyful note, right?
Yes, a cheerful note with which to head towards coffee, I think. You.